My name is Evelyn. I am 68 years old and I live in a small, secluded cabin nestled in the heart of the Colorado mountains. Outside my window, the world is often covered in a thick blanket of white snow, silent and breathtaking. People who see me today, standing tall with paint-stained fingers and a smile that reaches my eyes, call me a woman of strength. They see a successful artist. They see a woman who is finally free. But I want to tell you a secret. For 45 years I was a ghost. I lived in this very town but I was invisible. I wasn't an artist back then. I wasn't even Evelyn. I was simply David's wife. I remember the day I walked into our house as a young bride. I was 23 and my suitcase was filled with more than just clothes. It was filled with bright tubes of oil paints, sketchbooks and dreams of painting the world. But David didn't like mess. He was a man of order, a man of expensive suits and mahogany furniture. On our first week he looked at my paints and said, "Evelyn, we are adults now. Let's keep the house clean and professional. Painting is for children." Slowly, without realizing it, I tucked my dreams into a wooden box and hid them in the darkest corner of the attic. For the next 4 decades, my life became a series of duties. My mornings didn't start with the beauty of the sunrise. They started with the sound of David's coffee machine. I learned to make his coffee exactly how he liked it. Triple filtered, no sugar, served at precisely 160 degrees. If it was a degree hotter, he wouldn't complain out loud. He would just leave the cup on the table untouched, a silent punishment that hurt more than words. I spent my days polishing the antique wood in our home until my fingers were raw and aching. David hated dust. He wanted our home to feel like a museum, quiet, cold, and perfect. I learned to walk softly so I wouldn't disturb his reading. I learned to cook 3-course meals that looked like they belonged in a magazine. I was praised by the neighbors as the perfect wife. They would say, "Look at her, she takes such good care of him. She's so lucky." But every time they said the word lucky, it felt like a sharp needle piercing my heart. Because inside that perfect museum of a house I was suffocating. I had no identity of my own. I didn't buy a new coat without asking his opinion. I didn't invite a friend for tea without checking his schedule. My mood depended entirely on his mood. If he had a bad day at work, the whole house felt like a storm was coming. I would stay in the kitchen making his favorite beef stew, hoping the smell of good food would calm the anger in his eyes. I remember one afternoon about 10 years ago. It was autumn and the mountains were covered in brilliant shades of gold and orange. The beauty was so overwhelming that I felt a sudden, desperate urge to capture it. I didn't have my paints, so I took a paper napkin and a ballpoint pen. With trembling hands I drew a small, simple flower, a wild mountain columbine. For a moment I felt a spark of joy. I felt like me again. When David came home I showed it to him. I was like a child seeking approval. He looked at the napkin for 2 seconds, his face expressionless. Then he crumpled it into a ball and dropped it into the trash can. "Don't waste paper, Evelyn," he said. "And wash your hands. Dinner is late." I stood there looking at the trash can and I felt something break deep inside me. But I didn't fight back. I didn't scream. I just turned on the faucet and washed my hands, watching the ink of my little flower disappear down the drain. I told myself, this is my duty. This is what love looks like. A wife must sacrifice. I thought silence was peace. I thought giving up everything was love. I thought that as long as I kept him happy, my life was complete. I believed that this was all there was for me, a life of gray shadows and polished wood. I was 68 years old and I thought my story was already written. I thought I would die as David's shadow. But life had a very different plan for me. A plan that was about to shatter my world into 1,000 pieces. It was a Tuesday in January. I remember it because it was the coldest day of the year. Outside, a fierce Colorado snowstorm was howling, wrapping our cabin in a layer of ice. Inside, the fireplace was crackling and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. I was in the kitchen performing my usual ritual. I was carefully measuring the coffee beans, making sure everything was perfect for David's breakfast. I had spent 45 years perfecting this routine. I knew exactly how he liked his eggs, how he liked his toast, and how he liked his silence. David walked into the dining room. He was dressed in his heavy wool coat, looking sharp and professional as always. He sat down at the mahogany table, the same table I had polished for hours just the day before. "Coffee is almost ready, David," I said, keeping my voice low and gentle. He didn't answer. He didn't even look at the cup I placed in front of him. Instead, he stared straight ahead, his eyes as cold as the frost on the windows. "Evelyn," he said. His voice was calm, which made it even more terrifying. "Sit down. I have something to say." My heart began to race. I sat across from him, my hands trembling under the table. I thought perhaps he was sick, or perhaps there was trouble with our bank accounts. He took a slow breath and looked me in the eyes. "I've made a decision," he said. "I want a divorce." For a moment I forgot how to breathe. The world around me went silent. The crackling of the fire, the ticking of the clock, the whistling of the wind, everything stopped. I looked at him, searching for a sign that this was a joke. A cruel, dark joke. But his face was like stone. "A divorce," I whispered. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "But David, why? What did I do? I can fix it. Whatever it is, I can fix it." "It's not about fixing anything, Evelyn," he replied, standing up. "I'm just tired. I'm tired of this house. I'm tired of this life. I need a fresh start. I need to feel alive again, and I can't do that here. With you." Tired. The word felt like a physical blow to my chest. He was tired of the life I had sacrificed everything to build. I stood up and followed him as he walked toward the bedroom. I felt small, like a child begging for mercy. "David, please. Don't do this. I'll change. I promise. I won't talk as much. I'll keep the house even cleaner. I'll learn new recipes. I'll do anything you want. Just tell me what you need and I will be that woman." I was on my knees now, literally and metaphorically. I was offering to disappear even more, to erase the tiny bit of me that was left just to keep him. I thought that without him I was nothing. I thought that at 68, a woman's life ends if her husband leaves. "It's too late, Evelyn," he said, zipping up his leather suitcase. The sound of the zipper sounded like a final judgment. "I've already found an apartment in the city. My lawyer will contact you about the house." He didn't look at the tears streaming down my face. He didn't see the woman who had pressed his shirts for 45 years. He only saw an obstacle in the way of his fresh start. He picked up his bags and walked toward the front door. I followed him into the hallway, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. "David, it's a storm outside. You can't leave now. Wait until the morning. Let's just talk." He opened the door and a blast of freezing wind and snow rushed into the house. It felt like the cold was entering my very soul. "Goodbye, Evelyn," he said. He didn't look back. Not once. He stepped out into the white darkness, got into his car and drove away. I stood in the open doorway, the snow blowing against my face, watching his taillights disappear into the storm. I stood there for a long time, even after the sound of his engine had faded. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the sound of a 45-year-old life collapsing in an instant. I finally closed the door and locked it. I turned around and looked at our home. The mahogany table was still there. The coffee was still steaming in his cup. But the man I had lived for was gone. I fell to the floor in the hallway, right there on the cold tiles. I didn't just cry, I wailed. I was a 68-year-old woman, alone in a mountain cabin with no identity, no career, and now no husband. I was certain that my life was over. I was certain that the cold of that Colorado winter would finally swallow me whole. But as I lay there in the dark, I had no idea that this was not the end of my story. It was the brutal, painful beginning of the masterpiece I was about to create. The silence was the loudest thing in the house. For 45 years, this home had been filled with the sounds of David. The heavy thud of his boots, the clinking of his glass, the sound of the evening news on the television. But now, as I stood in the center of the living room, the quiet was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against my chest. I began to walk through the rooms, like a stranger exploring a museum. I walked into our bedroom and that's when it hit me, the smell. David's cologne. It was a musky, expensive scent of sandalwood and old leather. It was still hanging in the air, clinging to the curtains, hiding in the fibers of the carpet. It was a ghost that refused to leave. I closed my eyes and for a split second I thought he was standing right behind me. My heart leaped with a mixture of fear and hope. I turned around quickly, whispering his name. But there was no one. Only the cold Colorado sun peeking through the frost-covered windows. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my stomach. It wasn't hunger. It was the realization that I was truly, utterly alone. To distract myself, my body fell back into the only rhythm it knew, the routine. My feet moved on autopilot toward the kitchen. I took out the frying pan. I cracked 4 eggs, 2 for me, 2 for him. I put 4 slices of bread in the toaster. I carefully set the table, placing his favorite blue mug on the right side and my plain white one on the left. I poured the coffee, making sure his had that tiny splash of cream he always demanded. I sat down. I waited. I watched the steam rise from his mug in thin, swirling ribbons. I watched the clock on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. 1 minute passed. Then 5. The eggs grew cold. A thin film formed over the coffee. Then the toaster popped. The sharp noise made me flinch. I looked at the empty chair across from me. The mahogany was polished and shining, reflecting nothing but the gray light of the morning. There was no David. There was no fresh start for us. There was only a cold breakfast and a woman who had forgotten how to eat alone. A sob escaped my throat, a sound so raw it frightened me. I grabbed his blue mug and threw the coffee into the sink. I watched the dark liquid swirl down the drain, and it felt as if my own life was being washed away with it. I scraped the eggs into the trash, my hands shaking so violently that I dropped the fork. It hit the floor with a loud clang that seemed to echo through the entire house. "Stop it, Evelyn," I whispered to the empty walls. "Just stop it." I walked to the bathroom, desperate to wash the salt of my tears from my face. I splashed ice-cold water on my skin over and over, trying to shock my system into feeling something other than this hollow ache. I grabbed a towel, wiped my eyes, and finally I looked up. I looked into the mirror. I froze. I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. Who was she? Her skin was pale and translucent like old parchment. Her eyes were sunken, surrounded by a spiderweb of lines that I hadn't noticed before. Her hair was a messy, tangled halo of silver. But it wasn't the age that shocked me. It was the emptiness. I looked deep into my own pupils and saw nothing. No spark. No fire. No Evelyn. I realized that for nearly half a century, I had looked into this mirror only to check if I looked presentable for David. I had looked to see if my hair was neat for his dinner parties, or if my dress was modest enough for his liking. I had never once looked into the mirror to see me. I touched the glass with my fingertips, tracing the outline of my face. "Who are you?" I asked out loud. My voice was a raspy whisper. "Evelyn, where did you go?" The woman in the mirror didn't answer. She just stared back with a look of profound sadness. I realized then that David hadn't just taken his suitcases and his car. He had taken the light out of this house, and in doing so he had revealed that I was a hollow shell. I was a painting that had been left out in the rain until all the colors had bled away, leaving only a gray, blurry mess. I slumped against the cold marble of the sink and let the darkness wash over me. I thought the silence would be the end of me. I thought the echo of this empty house would eventually swallow me whole. I didn't know it yet, but this was the moment the gray paint began to crack. Behind the shadow in the mirror, a tiny, buried part of me was starting to wake up. And that part of me was about to lead me to the attic, to a box of colors that had been waiting for 40 years to be found. The silence of the house was becoming unbearable. To escape the memories in the kitchen and the smell of David's cologne in the bedroom, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I decided to clean the attic. The attic was a place David rarely visited. It was the graveyard of our home, a place where things were sent to be forgotten. I climbed the creaking wooden stairs, my heart thumping against my ribs. The air up there was thick with dust and the smell of dry wood. Sunlight filtered through a small circular window, dancing with millions of tiny dust motes. I began moving old boxes of winter clothes and broken lamps. And then, tucked away under a heavy moth-eaten blanket, I saw it. A small wooden chest. My breath caught in my throat. I knew this box. I had brought it with me 45 years ago, a relic from a life that felt like it belonged to a different person. I knelt on the cold floor, my knees aching, and blew the thick layer of dust off the lid. With trembling hands I lifted the latch. The hinges groaned, and as the lid opened, a scent wafted out, faint but unmistakable. Linseed oil and turpentine. Inside were my old college supplies. Tubes of oil paint, now hardened and cracked with age. Brushes with stiff, dry bristles. And a few small blank canvases that had turned slightly yellow over time. I picked up a tube of cerulean blue and squeezed it. It was stubborn, nearly solid. I remembered David's voice echoing from the past. "Evelyn, painting is a messy hobby. It's for children. We have a reputation to keep. For 40 years I had listened to that voice. I had kept my hands clean. I had kept my life tidy. But as I looked at those old brushes, a sudden fierce heat rose in my chest. David was gone. The house was empty. There was no one left to tell me that my joy was a mess. I didn't go back downstairs. I didn't get water or food. I grabbed a stiff brush and a half-dried tube of black and gray paint. I found a small wooden board leaning against the wall. I didn't plan. I didn't sketch. I didn't think about technique. I took a deep breath and made the first stroke. Freep. The sound of the dry brush against the wood was loud in the quiet attic. It felt electric. I dipped the brush into a bit of old oil and smashed it into the black paint. I began to move my arm with a strength I didn't know I possessed. I didn't paint a flower. I didn't paint the pretty mountains or a smiling face. I painted the storm. I painted the freezing wind that David had left me in. I painted the jagged edges of my broken heart. I used my fingers to smear the paint, feeling the cold, oily texture against my skin. I splashed gray against the black, creating a chaotic, swirling sky. It was dark. It was aggressive. It was honest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to be perfect. I wasn't trying to please a husband or a neighbor. I was just being. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in black streaks. My white apron was ruined. There was paint on my face and in my hair. If David had walked in at that moment, he would have been horrified. He would have called me a mess. But as I looked at the dark, swirling storm on the wooden board, I felt a strange, bubbling sensation in my chest. I realized it was a laugh. I am messy, I whispered to the empty attic. I am 68 years old and I am a beautiful, chaotic mess. A weight that I had been carrying for 45 years suddenly lifted. I didn't need a fresh start in a new city like David did. I just needed to stop asking for permission to exist. I sat there on the dusty floor, surrounded by my old paints, and watched the sun go down. The storm on the board was finished, but the fire inside me was just beginning to burn. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was an artist. And this attic, this dark, forgotten room, had just become my sanctuary. The masterpiece of my life had finally begun, and for the first time I was the one holding the brush. After that night in the attic, something shifted inside me. It was as if a dam had burst and 45 years of suppressed emotions were rushing out of me, demanding to be seen. I didn't stay in the attic for long. The house, David's museum, felt too cold, too sterile, and too empty. I decided that if I was going to live here alone, I wouldn't live in a graveyard of his memories. I began with the living room. I moved the heavy mahogany furniture that David loved so much. I pushed the expensive leather sofas against the wall to make space in the center. I rolled up the ancient, dusty carpets. And then I did the unthinkable. I took a bucket of bright sunflower yellow paint and threw it against the white, pristine wall. I watched the yellow liquid drip down the expensive wallpaper. For a second I felt a flash of panic. I could almost hear David's voice screaming, "Evelyn, what have you done? You've ruined everything." But then I smiled. I picked up a wide brush and started to spread the color. I wasn't just painting a wall. I was reclaiming my territory. Within a week the house was transformed. The smell of David's sandalwood cologne was gone, replaced by the sharp, honest scent of fresh oil paints and turpentine. The museum was dead. My studio was born. The walls were no longer bare. They were covered in canvases of all sizes. I spent 16 hours a day painting. I painted until my back ached and my eyes burned. It was a strange kind of healing. With every stroke of the brush, I felt like I was washing away a year of my marriage. One stroke for the time he forgot our 10th anniversary. Sweep. One stroke for the nights I cried in the bathroom so he wouldn't hear me. Swirl. One stroke for every dream I had buried just to make him comfortable. Splash. I painted the pain first. I used deep purples, bruised blues, and jagged blacks. I painted the loneliness of those long Colorado winters. I painted the coldness of his goodbye. But as the weeks turned into months, the colors began to change. The dark blues turned into soft teals. The blacks turned into warm, earthy browns. And then finally the gold appeared. I began to paint the sunrise over the mountains. I painted the hope I felt when I realized I could survive on my own. I wasn't just an old woman anymore. I was a creator. I was the master of my own universe. However, the world inside my house was safe. The The world outside was terrifying. One morning my neighbor, a kind woman named Sarah, knocked on the door. She hadn't seen me in weeks. When she stepped inside, she gasped. She looked at the vibrant, chaotic, beautiful mess of my living room and her eyes filled with tears. "Evelyn," she whispered, touching a canvas of a red bird breaking through a gray cloud. "This is breathtaking. You have a gift. You can't keep this hidden." She told me about the local town fair happening that weekend in the valley. She begged me to take at least one painting. I was terrified. "Oh, Sarah, no. These are just my feelings. No one wants to buy my feelings. David always said my art was just a childish mess." "David is gone, Evelyn," she said firmly. "It's time for the world to see who you really are." I stayed awake all Friday night pacing the floor. I felt like a young girl again, full of doubt and fear. But on Saturday morning, with trembling hands, I wrapped my favorite painting, the one of the mountain storm, in a brown cloth. I drove down to the town square. My heart was thumping so hard I thought it would burst through my chest. I felt exposed, as if I were walking into the market without any clothes on. These paintings were my soul, my secrets, my scars. I set up a small wooden easel in a quiet corner of the fair. I sat on a stool, kept my head down and waited. I felt like a fool. I expected people to walk by and laugh. I expected them to see a messy old woman. But then something happened. A young woman stopped in front of my easel. She stood there for a long time, completely silent. I didn't dare to look up. Finally she spoke. Her voice was trembling. "How did you know?" she asked. I looked up, confused. "Know what, dear?" "How it feels," she said, pointing to the dark, swirling clouds in my painting. "How it feels to be trapped in a storm and finally see a tiny bit of light." I looked at her and then I looked at my own painting. For the first time I realized that my story wasn't just mine. My pain wasn't just mine. I had painted the truth, and the truth was a bridge to another human being. "I know," I whispered, reaching out to touch her hand. "I know exactly how it feels." That was the moment I realized that my life hadn't ended when David walked out. It had simply shifted from a silent, gray monologue into a vibrant, colorful conversation with the world. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was finally, truly alive. The town fair was just the beginning. I thought selling a few small sketches would be enough to pay my heating bill, but life had a much larger canvas waiting for me. Among the crowd of tourists and locals, a man in a charcoal gray suit stood perfectly still in front of my easel. He didn't say anything for 10 minutes. He just stared at the mountain storm painting, the one I had created in my messy, paint-stained attic. I felt that old familiar anxiety creeping up my neck. I expected him to point out a mistake or tell me the colors were too loud. But when he finally looked at me, his eyes weren't judgmental. They were filled with a deep, quiet respect. "My name is Marcus," he said, handing me a professional card. "I own a gallery in Denver. I see thousands of paintings every year, Evelyn. Most of them are technically perfect, but they are hollow. Your work, it's different." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This is the most honest art I've seen in decades. You aren't just painting landscapes. You are painting human survival. I want to represent you." I felt the world tilt. Marcus didn't want David's wife. He didn't know about the mahogany table I used to polish or the coffee I served at exactly 160 degrees. He only saw Evelyn. 2 weeks later, I stood in a high-end gallery in Denver. The floors were polished marble and the lights were bright and focused. My paintings, my pain, my lonely winters, my yellow walls, were hanging there, framed in gold. The room was filled with wealthy collectors and art critics. I felt like an imposter in my simple dress, but then the gallery owner announced the first sale. "The masterpiece, Uncaged, has been sold," Marcus announced. I watched as a woman wrote a check. When Marcus handed it to me later that evening, my hands shook so hard I almost dropped it. It was for $12,000. $12,000. For 45 years I had to ask David for $20 to buy groceries. I had to justify every cent I spent on myself. I was a woman who had never owned a bank account that didn't have his name on it. I sat on a bench outside the gallery, clutching that piece of paper. It wasn't just money. It was my exit visa from the world of permission. It was the sound of a golden cage door swinging open. For the first time in my life I was financially free. I could buy my own paints, my own clothes, and I could keep my house warm without ever worrying about David's approval again. But the most powerful moment happened when I walked back into the gallery to look at my signature at the bottom of a canvas. For decades I had signed my name as Mrs. David Miller, on every legal document, every tax form, every greeting card. But on these paintings I had simply written, Evelyn. In that moment the old Evelyn, the one who lived in the shadows, the one who pressed shirts with a fever, the one who begged a cold man to stay, finally vanished. She was replaced by someone new. I was no longer a shadow. I was no longer a victim of a failed marriage. I was Evelyn the artist. I realized then that David hadn't left me with nothing. He had inadvertently left me with the space to become everything I was meant to be. My wealth wasn't just in my bank account. It was in the realization that my value had never been tied to a man. It had always been inside me, waiting for the gray paint of my marriage to be stripped away so that my true colors could shine. I was 68 years old and I was finally, for the first time, the protagonist of my own story. My life had become a beautiful symphony of colors. I woke up every day with a purpose. My house was no longer a museum of David's rules. It was a sanctuary of my art. I was at peace. And then one rainy Tuesday evening the ghost returned. A knock came at the front door. It wasn't the confident, sharp knock I remembered from David. He was hesitant, weak. When I opened the door my heart didn't race with fear. It didn't flutter with hope. It stayed perfectly still. There stood David. He looked smaller than I remembered. His expensive wool coat was damp from the rain, and his hair had turned a dull, dusty gray. The cold, arrogant fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by something that looked like regret. Evelyn, he said. His voice lacked the authority it once had. I've been reading about you. The gallery in Denver. The newspapers. You've done well for yourself. I didn't invite him in immediately. I just stood in the doorway, the scent of fresh oil paint from my studio clashing with the faint, lingering smell of his rain-soaked clothes. I made a mistake, Evelyn, he whispered, looking down at his muddy shoes. The same shoes I used to scrub on my knees. The city is loud. It's empty. I thought I wanted a fresh start, but I realized I just wanted what we had. I missed the quiet. I missed you. He looked past me into the house. He saw the yellow walls. He saw the canvases leaning against the mahogany table. He saw the mess he had spent 45 years trying to prevent. Everything is so different here, he said, stepping into the hallway without waiting. He turned to me with a forced smile, the same smile he used to use to get his way. But we can fix this. I can help you manage your success. We can rebuild the house. We can go back to how things were. I'm ready to come home, Evelyn. I looked at him and for the first time in my life I felt a deep sense of pity. He was looking at me but he still didn't see me. He saw a solution to his loneliness. He saw a good wife, who would fold his shirts and make his coffee at 160 degrees. I didn't say a word. I simply took his hand and led him into my studio, the room that used to be his pristine living room. I pointed to a large canvas resting on the easel. It was a painting of a golden cage. The door was wide open, swinging on broken hinges. Outside the cage was a vast, infinite horizon of purple mountains and golden light. What is this? David asked, confused. It's my masterpiece, David, I said. My voice was steady, clear, and filled with a strength I had spent 68 years finding. I spent 45 years painting the bars of that cage. I spent 45 years making sure you were comfortable inside it while I stood in the shadows. I stepped closer to him, looking him straight in the eyes. You didn't leave me because you were tired, David. You left because you thought I was nothing without you. But you were wrong. You were the one who kept the colors out of this house. You were the one who told me I was a mess. He opened his mouth to argue, to apologize, to manipulate, but I held up my hand. I forgive you, David. Truly. I forgive you because if you hadn't walked out that door in the storm, I would have died as your shadow. But I am not a shadow anymore. I looked at the painting, then back at him. I have finally finished the masterpiece of my life, I said, my voice echoing in the vibrant room. And I've realized something very important. There is no room for you in the frame. The silence that followed was absolute. David looked at the painting, then at my paint-stained hands, and then at the door. He finally understood. The woman he had left didn't exist anymore. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply turned around and walked out into the rain. And this time when the door closed, it didn't sound like a tragedy. It sounded like a celebration. The door clicked shut, and for the first time in my life, the sound of David leaving didn't feel like a hole in my heart. It felt like a period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of a museum. It was the quiet of a studio after a long day of work. Peaceful, creative, and full of potential. I walked out onto my porch and sat on the wooden swing. The rain had stopped and the clouds were breaking apart over the Colorado mountains. In the distance, the sun was beginning to set, and the sky was a riot of colors that no camera could ever truly capture. Deep oranges, fiery reds, and soft, bruised purples bled into one another. I looked at my hands. They were wrinkled, yes. They were tired. But they were covered in smears of cobalt blue and burnt sienna. They were the hands of a creator, not a servant. I breathed in the crisp mountain air. For 45 years I thought my life was a fixed image. A gray sketch that would never change. I thought that at 68 the book of my life was already in its final chapter. I believed that without David the story would simply stop. How wrong I was. As I watched the sun dip behind the snow-capped peaks, I realized a truth that I want to share with everyone watching this. Divorce did not end my life. It didn't ruin me and it didn't break me. Instead, it was the hand that stripped away the dull gray layers of my existence. It gave me back the colors I had hidden in the attic 40 years ago. It gave me the canvas, the brushes, and most importantly, the courage to paint a new one. My life is no longer about polishing someone else's furniture or making sure the coffee is exactly 160 degrees. My life is about the freedom to be messy. It's about the joy of discovering who I am when no one is watching. I am Evelyn. I am 68 years old. I am an artist. And I am finally truly happy. If you are standing in the middle of a storm right now, if you feel like your world has collapsed and you are left with nothing, please look at me. Look at my paint-stained fingers and my yellow walls. Your story is not over. The silence you hear right now is not an ending. It is a blank canvas. The masterpiece of your life is waiting for you to pick up the brush. Don't be afraid to be messy. Don't be afraid to be yourself. Because the most beautiful colors often come from the deepest pain. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If Evelyn's story touched your heart or gave you strength, please like this video and subscribe to our channel English Tide. Share this story with someone who might be sitting in the dark right now, waiting for the light to return. Remember, it is never too late to start your own masterpiece. Until next time, keep breathing, keep growing, and keep painting your own vibrant horizon.